Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we're short on time, but and I'll have some questions I'll submit in writing. But I think as I sit through these hearings, Mr. Chairman, what is so frustrating is that you get a very strong sense that there was nothing inevitable about any of this stuff. That people understood in the case of AIG and the market that how reckless their behavior was, that somehow we didn't realize this, I think, in sufficient detail so that come September, we spend 2 days trying to get the market or somebody in the private sector to figure out how to fix this. They can't. We make a decision that to the American may have been the right decision. I'm not saying that it's not, but the American public saw it as a very hasty decision. I think they still don't understand it. I think commitments that were made that they don't feel are being honored, and that's the difficulty that you're facing here and the frustration that you're hearing here. I mean, to think that these guys, even the reckless people that were writing these credit default swaps, finally in 2005 said, you know what, maybe we should stop writing this stuff because our model is starting to show that there may be a deterioration in the housing market. And we have no capacity, the regulators seem to not have a capacity to detect that that they've stopped writing the paper themselves. And I'll make that into a question, just is terribly worrisome because I don't think this really is Monday morning quarterbacking, because what we're trying to figure out is how to do the regulation in a way that makes sense. If we're not going to figure it out prospectively, there's no point in having regulators at all. So I guess one question I would ask here, and I got another one, so I don't want to take too much time. Is there a way to detect when people are doing things like stopping writing a bunch of credit default swaps, which ought to set off alarm bells about what's happening in the marketplace?
I think there are ways of trying to do that. One can look at the spreads, look at the activity, see that unusual things are going on. Think of the leverage in the U.S. financial system that was growing exponentially.
Another great example.
The maturity mismatches that were going on. So I think there are a variety of early warning signs that we should have perhaps looked at a little harder, that there perhaps should have been a systemic risk regulator, as some of the senators have talked about, who had the authority and opportunity to call out the problem, take some actions to do that. But I also think that there's never going to be a fail-safe system.
And I agree with that. I think that one would have hoped, it obviously didn't happen in this case, maybe until it was too late, that the boards of directors of these companies would have exercised a fiduciary duty on behalf of everybody and said, you know what, we're getting 30 times leverage, maybe that's too much, 25 times leverage, maybe that's too much. But I, for one, and I'm sure other people up here, will be interested to know how the regulator can create its own set of stoplights to be able to say, we feel like we're moving directionally in the wrong place or maybe in the right place prospectively, so that our only answer to the American people isn't, sorry, we missed this, and now we have to respond in a way that may or may not work, where we can maybe or maybe not predict, for example, what the underlying assets are worth here. So I, for one, look forward to working with you on that. Let me go to a second question here before my time has expired. Mr. Cohn, this is for you. I gather, I wasn't here in September, but I gather there was testimony in September from the Fed that the credit facility would result in no loss, no net loss to the taxpayer. And I'm wondering whether there's a change in the testimony today when what I think you're saying is that we're trying to mitigate whatever loss there may be. Is that a shift in the position of the Fed, or are we still telling the taxpayers there's not going to be any net loss after all this?
So I think the credit facility per se, the credit that the Federal Reserve has given, is fully securitized, and we do not expect a net loss from that. I think the open question is how much of the equity that the Treasury has put in, part of which went to pay off the Federal Reserve in November, will come back to the taxpayers.
So the Fed may be okay, but the Treasury may.
Well, and the way to look at it, you're absolutely right, Senator, is for the taxpayers. as a whole.
Right.
And I think that depends on how this company is handled from here on out. And that's what I mean when I say we're trying to do our best to make it so that any losses to the taxpayer are minimized. That, along with financial stability of the system and jobs for the Americans, are the motivators behind our actions here.
The last thing, Mr. Chairman, and I won't, I'll submit it in writing and with my other colleagues. I really am interested in hearing some testimony at some point on how these workouts are actually happening. In other words, who really is figuring out what what residual value there is in these operating units at an AIG, but for that matter, at some of the other things we may be looking at. Whose eyes are getting cast on that, both in the government and in the private sector, to be able to assure that when the time comes, the taxpayers really are getting the best return we can get on these sales. I won't wait for an answer on that, but I'll say I'm very interested in it. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.